Hey there, glad you made it. Tonight, we're stepping inside the Vatican, but not the one from postcards and paintings. Behind the gilded ceilings and solemn hymns, there were men who wore the papal crown not to guide, but to grasp. Not every pope was a shepherd. Some were tyrants, warmongers, and sinners cloaked in silk. Their stories aren't easy, but they're necessary. Because the past isn't a cathedral bathed in light. It's a hall of shadows, too. If you enjoy these deep, quiet dives into the murkier corners of history, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if it feels right. And tell me, where are you watching from tonight? What time is it where you are? I always love seeing the little echo of this story reach across continents. Now dim the lights, let the white noise settle in, and sink into the story with me. This one is about power, piety, and what happens when the two collide. Tonight we explore the dark legacies of men who wore the papal crown not to guide souls, but to dominate, exploit, and deceive. In the long arc of Christian history, the papacy has often been a symbol of hope, wisdom, and moral authority. But there have been times, long, bloody, unforgettable times, when that white vestment was soaked with ambition and sin. These were not the shepherds, they were the wolves. Their names are not remembered for doctrine or spiritual clarity, but for scandal, betrayal, and cruelty dressed as sanctity. For nearly 2,000 years, the papacy has survived wars, schisms, reformations, and revolutions. It has endured not because all its leaders were saints, but because the institution absorbed their sins, buried their legacies, and carried on. Tonight, we uncover the ones who nearly broke it. Not every pope was holy. Some were murderers, some were liars, and some were simply unfit for the throne of St. Peter. Before we begin, if you find these kinds of deep, haunting journeys into history compelling, feel free to like and subscribe, only if it feels genuine. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I always enjoy seeing that little constellation of watchers forming quietly across the world. Now lower the lights. Maybe let a fan hum in the background and prepare to step inside the golden walls of the Vatican, not for comfort, but for truth. In the year 955, a young man named Octavianus was elected pope under the name John XII. He was just 18 years old, and from the beginning it was clear that this was no shepherd of souls. His election was orchestrated by his father, Alberic II of Spoleto, a powerful Roman noble who ruled the city as princeps. On his deathbed, Alberic forced the Roman nobility to swear that his son would be made pope. And so it was that Octavianus, lacking both experience and spiritual depth, inherited not just the papacy but a kind of divine monarchy. What followed was a descent into scandal so grotesque that even his contemporaries could hardly believe it. John XII treated the Lateran Palace, the papal residence, as a personal brothel. Roman chroniclers accused him of holding feasts where wine was poured over sacred relics, and gambling sessions were conducted with bishops as guests. He reportedly toasted to Jupiter, Venus, and other pagan gods during drunken revelries, a shocking act even in a city where Christian and pagan customs still overlapped uneasily. He was accused of simony, incest, and even invoking demons for aid. His political dealings were just as reckless. John initially allied with Otto I, King of Germany, and crowned him Holy Roman Emperor in 962. But only a year later, he secretly conspired with Otto's enemies. When Otto learned of the betrayal, he marched on Rome and convened a synod in 963 to investigate the Pope's conduct. The accusations were staggering. The bishops declared John unfit for office and deposed him, but the story didn't end there. With the support of a Roman faction, John returned to power and unleashed revenge. He mutilated his enemies, executed clergymen who had testified against him, and resumed his indulgent lifestyle. In May 964, his life came to a sudden and scandalous end. Some sources claim he was struck in the head by a jealous husband after being caught with the man's wife. Others say he suffered a stroke during adultery. Regardless of the cause, his death was as sordid as his life. John XII left behind no theological legacy, no reforms, no moral guidance, only the bitter memory of what happens when spiritual authority is given to a boy drunk on power. If John XII was the most depraved teenager ever to sit on the papal throne, then Benedict IX was its most bewildering enigma, a pope who came to power not once, not twice, but 3 separate times across the course of his life. Born Theophylactus of Tusculum into one of the most powerful aristocratic families in 11th century Rome, Benedict IX first became pope in 1032, likely in his early 20s. His family practically purchased the papacy for him, leveraging their political influence to seat their own son as head of the church. What followed was a reign of such debauchery and scandal that chroniclers like Bishop Bonizo of Sutri would later call it a disgrace to the memory of Saint Peter. Benedict was accused of hosting orgies in the papal palace, committing rape, engaging in acts of sodomy, and consorting with demons. Even by the low standards of medieval politics, his behavior shocked the Roman public. In 1044, an uprising drove him from the city, replacing him with another pope, Sylvester III. But Benedict returned just months later, forcing Sylvester out. Then, in a move that historians still find almost absurd, he decided to sell the papacy. He approached his godfather, the archpriest John Gratian, and offered him the papal title for a sum of gold. Gratian accepted, taking the name Pope Gregory VI, supposedly to end the chaos and restore order. Yet Benedict soon regretted the deal and attempted to reclaim the papacy again, setting off a bizarre crisis where 3 different men simultaneously claimed to be pope. This mess could not be ignored. In 1046, King Henry III of Germany intervened. He summoned the Council of Sutri, which declared all three papal claimants deposed. Gregory VI, though arguably the most morally sound, resigned. Sylvester III was dismissed. Benedict IX fled. For his final appearance, Benedict returned yet again in 1047, but was excommunicated shortly afterward. His long and convoluted papal career ended in disgrace. No theological reforms, no doctrinal contributions, no acts of saintliness, just a revolving door of sin, greed, and ambition. To this day, Benedict IX remains one of the most infamous figures in Catholic history. He didn't merely tarnish the papacy, he turned it into a farce, a spectacle of corruption wrapped in holy robes. In the long ledger of papal corruption, few names cast a darker, more enduring shadow than Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI. Born in 1431 in Valencia, Spain, Borgia rose through the church ranks with alarming speed thanks to his powerful uncle, Pope Calixtus III. By the time he was elected pope in 1492, the Borgia name already carried whispers of excess and manipulation. But nothing prepared Rome for what Alexander would become. His election itself was shrouded in bribery and political deals. Cardinals were promised wealth, land, and lucrative positions. Once seated as pontiff, Alexander wasted no time consolidating power for his family. He openly acknowledged multiple children, most notoriously Cesare and Lucrezia, whom he sought to install in powerful positions across Europe. Cesare, first made a cardinal and later a military commander, became a ruthless enforcer of the Borgia legacy. Lucrezia was married off multiple times for political gain, and though many of the darkest rumors about her, including incest and poisoning, remain historically uncertain, the atmosphere of scandal was undeniable. The most infamous tale of Alexander's papacy remains the Banquet of the Chestnuts, a debauched party allegedly held in the papal palace in 1501. Contemporary accounts, especially that of Johann Burchard, describe a night of food, wine, and more than 50 courtesans, all in the service of entertaining high-ranking clergy. Coins were reportedly tossed onto the floor, with naked women crawling to retrieve them. Alexander watched from a throne, surrounded by his closest allies. Whether this event occurred exactly as described is debated by historians, but the fact that such a story could persist so vividly speaks to the moral decay of his papal court. Yet Alexander VI was not without competence. He strengthened the administration of the Papal States, reasserted Vatican control over wayward territories, and funded major artistic commissions. But all of this was eclipsed by his brazen nepotism, unchecked ambition, and the culture of fear and suspicion he nurtured. When he died in 1503, many suspected poisoning, though it was likely malaria. His corpse bloated so badly in the Roman heat that it could not fit into a standard coffin. The legacy of Alexander VI is not that of a spiritual leader, but of a political predator, cunning, indulgent, and unashamed. His reign did not erode trust in the Church, it detonated it. Among the strangest and most grotesque episodes in the entire history of the Catholic Church is one that still defies belief even after more than 1,000 years, the Cadaver Synod. It took place in 897 during the short and turbulent reign of Pope Stephen VI. Rome at the time was fractured, not just spiritually but politically, ruled by powerful aristocratic families who treated the papacy like a pawn on a blood-stained chessboard. Stephen VI, installed by the Spoleto faction, came to power in the wake of bitter rivalries and long-standing resentment against his predecessor, Pope Formosus. But Formosus was already dead. He had died in 896 and been buried with the honors due a pontiff. That should have been the end of his story, but Stephen, driven by vengeance or the demands of his political backers, ordered Formosus's body exhumed from its tomb. What followed was a spectacle of madness. The rotting corpse of Formosus was dressed in papal vestments, propped up on a throne inside the Lateran Basilica, and put on trial before a council of clergy. A deacon was assigned to speak on behalf of the dead man, while Stephen shouted accusations of perjury, violating canon law, and unlawfully assuming the papacy. The corpse could not answer. It swayed and sagged as the trial dragged on, a grim parody of justice. When the verdict was inevitably declared guilty, Stephen ordered the papal vestments stripped from the body. The 3 fingers used for blessing were severed. The cadaver was dragged through the streets and thrown into the Tiber River. According to some sources, the body washed ashore and was later buried in secret by sympathetic monks. The public reaction was not what Stephen had expected. Outrage erupted across Rome. Riots flared. Within months, Stephen VI was imprisoned and strangled to death in his cell. His bizarre trial had not just humiliated the memory of Formosus, it had turned the Church into a spectacle of horror. Future popes condemned the Cadaver Synod, nullified its rulings, and reburied Formosus with honor. But the damage was done. For centuries afterward, the image of a pope screaming at a corpse would linger as one of the darkest symbols of papal corruption and cruelty. Not all papal corruption came shrouded in secrecy or masked behind theological pretense. In the case of Pope Urban VI, the brutality was raw, visible, and terrifying. Elected in 1378, Urban began his reign with the hope of restoring the papacy to Rome after nearly 70 years of residence in Avignon, France. His election followed the death of Pope Gregory XI and was marked by chaos. The Roman populace, desperate to ensure an Italian pope would succeed Gregory, rioted in the streets. The cardinals, fearing for their safety, hastily chose Bartolomeo Prignano, the Archbishop of Bari, believing his temperament to be calm and his politics inoffensive. But once crowned as Urban VI, a transformation occurred. He quickly revealed himself as erratic, paranoid, and prone to violent outbursts. He publicly berated cardinals, threatened bishops, and turned the Vatican into a climate of fear. When some of his cardinals attempted to flee and elect a rival pope in what would become the beginning of the Western Schism, Urban declared them traitors. He captured 5 of them, imprisoned them in the castle at Nocera, and subjected them to unspeakable torture. Chroniclers reported their screams could be heard beyond the walls. Some were beaten to death, others starved. His cruelty became legendary. Urban even had his own officials whipped for minor mistakes, and his temper ruled over reason. His behavior alienated not only church leaders, but also monarchs across Europe. The schism deepened when a group of cardinals, declaring Urban's election invalid due to the circumstances of public coercion, chose a new pope, Clement VII, who re-established a rival papal court in Avignon. For the next 4 decades, Christendom was divided, with kings and clergy choosing sides in a battle for legitimacy that was both spiritual and political. Urban refused to recognize the rival line and excommunicated anyone who did. He died in 1389, largely isolated, reviled by many of his contemporaries, and remembered not as a defender of the faith, but as the spark that ignited one of the Church's greatest internal catastrophes. His legacy is not one of holiness or reform. It is a portrait of unchecked rage wearing the robe of the Vicar of Christ. When Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici ascended to the papacy in 1513 as Pope Leo X, the world beheld not a priest rising through divine merit, but a prince cloaked in vestments. Born into the immensely powerful Medici family of Florence, Leo was steeped in wealth, art, and privilege from birth. He was made a cardinal at the age of 13, long before he ever took holy orders. His election as pope was less a reflection of spiritual vocation than it was the crowning achievement of Renaissance dynastic politics. Upon taking office, Leo is said to have remarked, "God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it," and enjoy it he did. His court rivaled that of any secular monarch. Feasts, banquets, theatrical performances, and endless processions of luxury became the backdrop of his reign. The Vatican treasury, which had been modestly replenished under his predecessors, was soon emptied to fund Leo's ambitious building projects and extravagant lifestyle. But it was not mere excess that defined his pontificate. It was what he did to refill the coffers that left an irreversible scar on the Church. Leo X authorized the widespread sale of indulgences, documents sold to the faithful promising the reduction of punishment for sin. While indulgences had existed before, under Leo they became a booming industry. Priests and friars traveled across Europe proclaiming salvation in exchange for coin. One notorious preacher, Johann Tetzel, reportedly cried, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, The soul from purgatory springs. The backlash was immediate. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, directly challenging the corruption of indulgence sales. Leo, confident in his authority, dismissed the monk as a drunken German who would rethink his rebellion once sober. But Luther's challenge could not be silenced. Within years, the Protestant Reformation exploded across Europe, fracturing the religious unity of Western Christendom. Instead of guiding the Church through reform, Leo excommunicated Luther and continued with court theatrics. He died in 1521, heavily in debt and unaware of the full extent of the catastrophe he had helped unleash. History remembers Leo X not for the splendor he cultivated, but for the spiritual empire he lost through pride, indulgence, and an unshakable belief that the church could be bought and sold like a Florentine masterpiece. In the early 10th century, long before the grandeur of Renaissance popes or the fury of Reformation schisms, the Vatican was already drowning in intrigue and moral decay. One of the figures who embodied this decay most fully was Pope Sergius III, a man whose rise to power was steeped in bloodshed and whose legacy is forever tied to one of the darkest eras in papal history, the pornocracy. Sergius III became pope in 904, during a period when Rome was effectively ruled by powerful aristocratic families, particularly the Theophylacts. These noble factions treated the papacy like a family inheritance, installing compliant clerics as popes to serve their political agendas. Sergius had already attempted to seize the papal throne years earlier, and when he finally succeeded, it was at the expense of rivals who were exiled, deposed, or assassinated. His legitimacy was built on violence, not consensus. But what truly defines Sergius's reign is not merely the blood he spilled to ascend, but the relationships he forged once seated on the throne. According to contemporary accounts, Sergius took a mistress named Marozia, daughter of the influential Theophylact family. She was young, ambitious, and widely believed to have been the true power behind the papal throne. Their affair produced a son who would later become Pope John XI. Yes, in one of the most damning and bizarre chapters of papal history, a pope may have fathered another pope. Sergius III's papacy marked the beginning of a period later referred to as the pornocracy, or rule of harlots, a time when the Vatican was controlled not by spiritual leaders but by the whims of aristocratic women and their lovers. Under Sergius, church offices were sold for profit. The memory of past popes was twisted for political gain, and Rome was reduced to a playground for the corrupt elite. He even reversed the condemnation of Pope Formosus, who had been tried posthumously in the infamous Cadaver Synod, only to later re-condemn him again, a political ploy to appease whichever faction served his needs. Sergius III died in 911, still in power, still feared, but never revered. His legacy is not one of theological insight or ecclesiastical reform, but of nepotism, violence, and unchecked ambition wrapped in the veil of apostolic succession. He did not lead the church. He possessed it. The papacy has endured its share of tyrants, but few declared their authority with the arrogance and divine self-certainty of Pope Boniface VIII. Born Benedetto Caetani around 1230, Boniface rose through the ecclesiastical ranks with a sharp legal mind and a talent for political maneuvering. When he became pope in 1294, it was under unusual circumstances. His predecessor, Pope Celestine V, was a humble hermit who, overwhelmed by the complexities of the office, abdicated after only 5 months. Boniface seized the opportunity, convinced Celestine to step down, and then imprisoned him for the rest of his life to prevent any challenge to his legitimacy. From the beginning, Boniface viewed the papacy not just as a spiritual office, but as a divine monarchy. His most infamous declaration came in 1302, with the papal bull Unam Sanctam, a document that claimed ultimate authority not only over the church, but over all earthly kings and rulers. It is absolutely necessary for salvation, he wrote, that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. This assertion brought him into direct conflict with King Philip IV of France, a monarch just as ruthless and ambitious as the Pope himself. When Boniface attempted to prevent Philip from taxing French clergy without papal approval, the king retaliated with a smear campaign, accusing the Pope of heresy, corruption, and even sorcery. The conflict escalated rapidly. In 1303, a group of Philip's allies, led by Guillaume de Nogaret and supported by members of the Colonna family, longtime enemies of Boniface, stormed the papal residence in Anagni. They found the elderly pope alone, defiant, and seated in full regalia. According to some accounts, he was slapped across the face by one of the attackers, a symbolic blow to papal authority. He was held prisoner for 3 days before being freed by local townspeople, but the ordeal had broken him. Boniface returned to Rome, where he died within a month, reportedly of fever and shock. His reign left the church humiliated and exposed. Years later, the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri would place Boniface VIII in the 8th circle of hell, reserved for corrupt churchmen. It was a fitting place for a man who claimed godlike power, but ruled with brutality and hubris. Boniface did not defend the sanctity of the church. He tried to turn it into a throne above all thrones, and fell hard when the world refused to bow. If Boniface VIII crowned himself as an emperor of souls, then Pope Innocent III wielded power with the chilling conviction of a general blessed by heaven. Elected in 1198 at the age of 37, Lotario dei Conti di Segni was one of the youngest popes in history and one of the most theologically sophisticated. He believed deeply in the supremacy of the Church over all earthly realms, describing the Pope as lower than God but higher than man. But unlike many of his corrupt predecessors, Innocent III did not indulge in personal vice. His ambition was far more devastating. He was the architect of holy war, not just abroad, but at home. In 1202, he launched the Fourth Crusade, a campaign ostensibly aimed at reclaiming the Holy Land from Muslim control. But the crusade never reached Jerusalem. Instead, it was diverted through a series of tangled political and financial deals that culminated in the sack of Constantinople in 1204. Catholic crusaders, men sworn to liberate sacred ground, looted churches, raped nuns, and installed a Latin regime in the heart of the Byzantine Empire. The Pope, when informed, expressed mild outrage but ultimately accepted the plunder and political victory. The damage to Christian unity, however, was incalculable. But Innocent's most horrifying campaign was not against Muslims or Orthodox Christians. It was against fellow Catholics. In 1209, he declared the Albigensian Crusade, a war of extermination against the Cathars, a Christian sect in southern France labeled heretical for their dualist beliefs. Entire cities were besieged. When a papal legate was asked how to distinguish between heretics and faithful Catholics within the walls of Béziers, he reportedly replied, "Kill them all. God will know his own." What followed was a massacre of over 20,000 men, women, and children. Innocent watched from afar as the blood flowed, and he praised the victories as signs of divine favor. He also laid the groundwork for what would later become the Inquisition, formalizing procedures for identifying and punishing heresy within Europe. Innocent III died in 1216, convinced of the righteousness of his mission. He did centralize papal power and codify aspects of canon law, but these administrative accomplishments are inseparable from the violence and repression he unleashed. He didn't fall from grace like Boniface VIII. He stood firmly within the Church's embrace, a pope who believed that spiritual authority required the sword and was willing to use it on his own flock. When Julius II became pope in 1503, the Church did not gain a shepherd, it gained a soldier. Born Giuliano della Rovere, he was a product of nepotism from the beginning, elevated to the cardinalate by his uncle, Pope Sixtus IV. From his earliest days in the Curia, Julius was known more for his ambition and military cunning than for any spiritual insight. By the time he seized the papal throne, after a series of vicious political maneuvers, he had already made powerful enemies, including the infamous Borgia family. But Julius was no puppet. He came to the papacy determined to reassert the authority of Rome over the Italian peninsula and beyond, not through sermons or scripture, but with steel and siege engines. He is most remembered for leading armies into battle while wearing armor adorned with the papal insignia. In 1506, he personally marched alongside his troops to reclaim Perugia and Bologna, cities that had broken from papal control. The image of the Pope as a commander-in-chief riding into war shocked many and invigorated others. But for all the splendor of military triumphs, Julius left a spiritual vacuum at the center of the church. He convened councils not to address corruption or theological reform, but to solidify alliances and punish dissenters. Simony flourished under his rule, with high offices and bishoprics sold to the highest bidder. He feuded with the French monarchy, excommunicated rivals for political disobedience, and became entangled in endless Italian wars that drained the Church's treasury and moral credibility. Yet in an irony that defines his legacy, Julius II also commissioned one of the most magnificent artistic achievements in Christian history, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Under his patronage, Michelangelo created a vision of divine grandeur that continues to awe pilgrims and tourists alike. The man who led sieges and expelled enemies also built beauty, but that beauty did not cleanse the blood from his hands. When Julius died in 1513, Rome mourned a leader who had restored the Church's political might, but left its soul untended. He reigned not as a servant of God, but as a prince among warlords. In the pages of history, Julius II is remembered not for saving the faith, but for proving how far from grace a pope could ride in full battle gear. There are few moments in church history as viscerally unsettling as the night Pope Alexander VI presided over what would become known as the Banquet of the Chestnuts. The year was 1501, and the place was the Apostolic Palace in the Vatican. Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, had already earned a reputation as one of the most shamelessly corrupt popes in history. His election in 1492 was a masterpiece of bribery, orchestrated with precision and ruthlessness. Once enthroned, he wasted no time using the papacy as a tool to enrich and empower his family. But it wasn't just political manipulation that earned him infamy. It was the utter lack of spiritual restraint. The Borgia court became synonymous with decadence. That infamous banquet, recorded in the diary of Papal Master of Ceremonies Johann Burchard, described a feast where more than 50 courtesans were invited to dine and dance before high-ranking clergy and members of the Borgia family. After the meal, the women undressed and an orgy ensued. Burchard wrote that prizes of silk garments and gold coins were awarded to the men who could engage in the most acts of intercourse. Alexander, it is said, watched from his throne, silent and approving. Whether every detail is true is still debated, but the fact that such accounts were taken seriously by his contemporaries and passed down by multiple sources reveals how profoundly the moral compass of the Vatican had been broken. Under Alexander's rule, Rome became a marketplace for spiritual and political favors. Bishoprics and cardinalships were bought and sold. Indulgences flowed in exchange for coin. He arranged strategic marriages for his children and was unashamed in promoting his son, Cesare Borgia, as a cardinal, a military leader, and even a rumored assassin. The Church, in his hands, was not a bastion of holiness, but a family enterprise, a syndicate wrapped in red robes, and yet he was also a competent administrator who strengthened the Papal States and supported Renaissance art. But these accomplishments remain footnotes beneath the rot of his personal reign. Alexander VI died in 1503, likely of malaria, though whispers of poison surrounded his death. His corpse swelled grotesquely before burial, as if his body itself refused to pass quietly. He is remembered not for doctrine, not for faith, but for turning the Vatican into a theater of power, lust, and whispered death. While some popes corrupted the Church through personal vice or political betrayal, Pope Paul IV represents a different breed entirely, one whose cruelty was clothed in the language of righteousness. Born Gian Pietro Carafa in 1476, Paul IV was a former head of the Roman Inquisition, a man who believed that deviation from Catholic doctrine was not merely error, but disease. When he was elected pope in 1555, he brought with him the fervor of a zealot and the severity of a judge. The Renaissance popes before him had embraced humanist ideals, commissioned art, and shown some tolerance for intellectual discourse. Paul IV reversed all of it with chilling resolve. One of his first acts was to expand the powers of the Inquisition. Under his rule, the Holy Office became an apparatus of fear and surveillance. Torture was sanctioned, books were burned, clergy were imprisoned. Even cardinals were not safe from his purges if they were suspected of sympathy for reformers or heretics. The Index of Forbidden Books, formalized during his reign, became a blunt instrument to silence dissent, suppress scientific thought, and roll back centuries of intellectual advancement. But his repression did not stop with theology. Paul IV harbored a virulent anti-Semitism that shaped Vatican policy for decades. In 1555, he issued the bull Cum Nimis Absurdum, which forced Jews in Rome to live in a walled ghetto, restricted their professions, banned them from owning property, and compelled them to wear identifying clothing. He referred to Jews as wretched and condemned, stripping them of rights with the full weight of papal authority. This marked the first time that a formal Jewish ghetto was instituted in Rome, setting a precedent for ghettos throughout Europe. The cruelty of these measures echoed long after his death. Paul IV was also obsessed with erasing the influence of his predecessors. He removed the statues of previous popes from churches and attempted to discredit the Council of Trent for what he perceived as insufficient harshness toward heresy. When he died in 1559, the people of Rome erupted in celebration. Mobs stormed the Inquisition buildings, tore down his statues, and even attempted to destroy his tomb. Paul IV was not a libertine or a schemer. He was something colder, a man who believed that mercy endangered souls, that control equaled salvation, and that fear was the purest path to obedience. His legacy is not painted in lust or gold, but in smoke, silence, and chains. In the early 14th century, Pope Clement V sat not in Rome, but in Avignon, France, marking the beginning of what would later be known as the Avignon Papacy, a period when the seat of St. Peter was relocated and, many believed, subordinated to the French crown. Born Raymond Bertrand de Got in Gascony, Clement was a politically convenient choice for King Philip IV of France after the contentious death of Pope Boniface VIII. He was crowned in Lyon in 1305, and almost immediately he set a precedent of appeasement that would come to define his pontificate. The most damning decision of Clement V's reign was his treatment of the Knights Templar. Once one of the most powerful and wealthy military orders in Christendom, the Templars had grown into a transnational institution with their own banking networks, lands, and armed forces. Philip IV, heavily indebted to them and eager to consolidate his power, saw an opportunity. In 1307, he ordered the mass arrest of the Templars in France, accusing them of heresy, idolatry, and moral depravity. The charges were almost certainly fabricated, extracted under torture, and designed to destroy the order and seize its assets. Initially, Clement V hesitated to intervene. As Pope, the Templars answered directly to him, not to any king, but rather than defend the order or challenge Philip, Clement caved. In 1312, under intense pressure and threats from the French crown, he issued the papal bull Vox in Excelso, formally dissolving the Knights Templar. The order was disbanded without a fair trial, and its leaders, including Grand Master Jacques de Molay, were burned at the stake in Paris. It was a moment of moral collapse cloaked in canonical authority. Clement's papacy also marked the weakening of Rome as the spiritual and symbolic center of Catholicism. By remaining in Avignon and appointing predominantly French cardinals, he reinforced the perception that the Church had become a puppet of the French monarchy. While he did attempt some reforms and oversaw missions to the Mongol Empire, these accomplishments were overshadowed by his failure to stand firm in the face of injustice. Clement V died in 1314. His body so swollen by illness and heat that it reportedly burst during his funeral. He left behind not only a church in exile, but a legacy of silence. Silence in the face of cruelty, silence in the shadow of kings. In 1471, Francesco della Rovere was elected pope and took the name Sixtus IV, ushering in a reign that would become a study in contradictions. Part spiritual ruler, part Renaissance prince, part political schemer. Sixtus is perhaps best remembered for commissioning the construction of the Sistine Chapel, a crowning architectural achievement of the papal court and a symbol of divine grandeur. But behind those frescoed walls was a man whose papacy was defined as much by nepotism and intrigue as by artistic patronage. Sixtus IV came from humble origins, but once he assumed the papacy, he moved swiftly to elevate his family. He appointed 6 of his nephews to the College of Cardinals, many of them young and lacking qualifications. One such appointment was that of Giuliano della Rovere, his future successor as Pope Julius II. The favoritism extended to granting powerful secular offices to relatives across Italy, effectively turning the papacy into a familial dynasty. But Sixtus did not stop at nepotism. He became entangled in one of the most infamous political conspiracies of the era, the Papacy conspiracy. In 1478, members of the Papacy family, with support from the Archbishop of Pisa and likely encouragement from the Pope, plotted to assassinate Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother Giuliano during Mass in Florence's cathedral. Giuliano was murdered on the altar. Lorenzo survived. The Medici response was swift and brutal, and though the extent of Sixtus's involvement remains debated, his connection to the conspirators was undeniable. He excommunicated Lorenzo and placed Florence under interdict when the plot unraveled, using spiritual authority as a tool of vengeance. Sixtus also authorized the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition in 1478, which would evolve into one of the most feared institutions of religious control and persecution. Though he claimed the goal was to root out heresy, the methods, torture, forced conversions, and executions would long outlive his pontificate. When he died in 1484, the Roman people reportedly looted the papal palace, a signal of how little love remained for him. Sixtus IV's legacy is a paradox. The patron of Michelangelo and Botticelli, the builder of sacred beauty, and yet a pope whose hands were deeply stained with political violence, familial corruption, and repression masked as piety. In the chaotic landscape of the Western Schism, where rival popes claimed legitimacy and kingdoms chose sides in a fractured Christendom, one figure emerged whose papacy was defined by deception and ambition rather than doctrine or virtue. Baldassare Cossa, better known as Antipope John XIII, was elected in 1410 by the Council of Pisa as a supposed solution to the crisis, but his reign only deepened the confusion. At the time, the Church was already suffering from division. After the papacy had returned from Avignon to Rome, disputes about succession led to two competing lines, one based in Rome, the other in Avignon. In 1409, a group of cardinals attempted to resolve the schism by deposing both existing popes and electing a third, Alexander V. But when Alexander died the following year, Baldassare Cossa was chosen to replace him. The result? 3 popes, each excommunicating the others, each claiming to be the true vicar of Christ. Cossa, a former pirate and canon lawyer from Naples, had earned a reputation for both ruthlessness and cunning. As John XIII, he ruled from Bologna and styled himself a reformer, but behind that facade lay corruption on a monumental scale. He was accused of simony, murder, sexual misconduct, and even sodomy. Contemporary reports described his court as decadent and violent, filled with intrigue, bribery, and vice. He sold ecclesiastical offices, levied heavy taxes on clergy, and surrounded himself with mercenaries. His military campaigns against rival city-states left trails of blood, while his personal life scandalized even his allies. Eventually, his enemies had enough. In 1414, the Council of Constance was convened to end the schism once and for all. Under growing pressure from secular rulers and church leaders alike, John XXIII fled the council in disguise, but he was captured and brought back in chains. In 1415, he was formally deposed. The council described him as a sower of discord, a scandal to the church, and a disgrace to the name of Pope. Though he would later be pardoned and made a cardinal again, his time as Pope, or anti-Pope, left a stain that would take decades to cleanse. His name was so tarnished that when Angelo Roncalli became Pope in 1958, he deliberately chose to be known as John XXIII, clarifying that Baldassare Cosa had never been recognized as legitimate. That decision, centuries later, still echoed with the memory of a man who treated the papacy like a pirate's prize. In the 10th century, when the papacy was little more than a bargaining chip between warring Roman noble families, one pontiff stood out not for his wisdom or reform, but for the utter chaos that surrounded his brief and brutal reign. Pope Boniface VII, known by some chroniclers as the anti-pope and by others as the horrible pope, seized the throne twice and left behind a legacy of blood, theft, and scandal. His first appearance on the papal stage came in 974, after the death of Pope John XIII. At the time, Crescentius, the head of a powerful Roman faction, had positioned his candidate Benedict XVI as pope with the support of the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I. But after Otto's death, the Roman aristocracy saw an opening. Boniface, born Franco Ferrucci, allied himself with this faction and participated in a violent coup. Benedict XVI was imprisoned in Castel Sant'Angelo and later strangled to death, possibly on Boniface's orders. Boniface then declared himself pope, but his control of Rome was short-lived. As Emperor Otto II moved to reassert imperial influence, Boniface fled to Constantinople, carrying with him a cache of stolen Vatican treasures. For nearly a decade, he lived in exile while other popes held office. But in 984, after the death of Pope John XIV, Boniface returned. He again seized power, reportedly with the help of bribes and foreign mercenaries. His second reign was even shorter and more violent than the first. Rome descended into fear and disorder, and his enemies plotted in secret. Later that same year, Boniface VII was found dead, likely murdered. His body was dragged through the streets of Rome by a mob and left beneath a statue in the Lateran, a grim public display of contempt. He was never given the honor of burial in St. Peter's. Even centuries later, church historians and reformers would point to his name as a cautionary tale of what happens when secular ambition consumes sacred office. Boniface VII's papacy was not marked by heresy or doctrinal failure, but by something perhaps worse: the open desecration of the Church's moral core. His reign was not a stumble, it was a collapse. In 1378, a papal election took place that would fracture the unity of Western Christendom for nearly 4 decades. At its center was Pope Urban VI, born Bartolomeo Prignano, whose rise to power began as a compromise and ended in a nightmare. Following the return of the papacy to Rome from Avignon under Pope Gregory XI, the College of Cardinals gathered in a climate of panic and volatility. Roman crowds, fearing another French pope would return the seat to Avignon, surrounded the conclave demanding an Italian successor. Whether out of genuine conviction or sheer fear, the cardinals elected Prignano, the Archbishop of Bari, an Italian but not a cardinal. At first, Urban VI appeared to be the reformer the Church needed. He criticized the excesses of the cardinals, promoted austerity, and spoke passionately about curbing corruption. But his zeal quickly curdled into tyranny. He raged in public meetings, accused his closest allies of betrayal, and surrounded himself with informants. His paranoid and violent outbursts unnerved even his supporters. Within months, many of the cardinals who had elected him regretted their decision. Citing coercion by the Roman mobs, they declared his election invalid and chose a new pope, Clement VII, who re-established the papal court in Avignon. Thus began the Western Schism, a period from 1378 to 1417 when 2 and eventually 3 men claimed to be the legitimate pope. Urban VI, undeterred and vengeful, labeled his opponents heretics and launched his own reign of terror from Rome. He imprisoned 6 cardinals suspected of disloyalty. Reports describe them being tortured in Castel Sant'Angelo, beaten, starved, and denied trial. 5 died in captivity. Urban excommunicated entire factions of European clergy and refused all efforts at reconciliation. He surrounded himself with loyalists and continued to rule in increasing isolation, more like a fortress commander than a spiritual leader. His papacy was consumed not by doctrine, but by distrust and rage. When he died in 1389, few mourned. The schism he helped ignite would take 2 more popes and a great council to finally end. Urban VI left behind no theological legacy, no enduring reforms, only the bitter taste of division and a church cracked open by fear and fury. In the year 964, the papacy was caught in the middle of a power struggle between the spiritual authority of Rome and the imperial might of the German Holy Roman Emperors. At the heart of this struggle was Pope John XII, a man whose pontificate reads more like the chronicle of a decadent prince than that of a holy shepherd. Born Octavianus of the powerful Tusculum family, he was elected pope at the astonishing age of 18, chosen not for his wisdom or holiness, but for his family's political leverage. Almost immediately, his papacy fell into scandal. Contemporary sources, even those accustomed to the moral flexibility of the 10th century, were appalled by his behavior. He was accused of turning the Lateran palace into a brothel, hosting orgies, and engaging in affairs with both noblewomen and his own relatives. Chroniclers claimed he toasted the devil during feasts, gambled, and invoked pagan gods during rituals. Whether every allegation was true or exaggerated by his enemies, the pattern was clear. John XII treated the papal office as a personal playground. His politics were just as reckless. In a desperate move to protect his position against Roman rivals, John crowned Otto Reis as Holy Roman Emperor in 962. But only 2 years later, he betrayed Otto by secretly negotiating with his enemies. When Otto returned to Rome and convened a synod, John XII fled. The council deposed him in absentia, and a new pope, Leo VIII, was elected. But John refused to accept this, and after Otto left the city, he stormed back with armed supporters, expelled Leo, and resumed his reign as if nothing had happened. His return was brief and marked by vengeance. He mutilated and executed his enemies, imposed fines on bishops who had sided with the emperor, and reigned with open contempt for canon law. His death in 964 was as sudden and sordid as his life. According to one account, he died of a stroke while in bed with a married woman. His death marked not just the end of a scandalous reign, but a brutal reminder of what happened when a papal tiara was placed on the head of a boy with unchecked power and no sense of the sacred. As the 13th century drew to a close, Pope Nicholas III stood at the helm of a church that was already deeply entangled in the machinery of political power. Born Giovanni Gaetano Orsini in 1216, he hailed from one of Rome's most powerful noble families. His election to the papacy in 1277 was no surprise to those familiar with the Orsini grip on ecclesiastical politics. But it was precisely this family connection that would come to define and taint his papal reign. Unlike some of the more flamboyant or overtly corrupt popes before and after him, Nicholas III cloaked his ambitions in the robes of reform. Outwardly, he spoke of spiritual renewal, ecclesiastical discipline, and curbing the influence of nepotism. Yet in practice, he became one of the most nepotistic pontiffs of the medieval era. Within months of taking office, he appointed 3 of his nephews to key positions within the church, and placed relatives in powerful administrative and military roles throughout the papal states. He maneuvered to secure lands and revenues for the Orsini family, ensuring that their political dominance would remain intact long after his death. The papacy, under Nicholas, served not the universal church, but the dynastic survival of a single Roman clan. His diplomatic dealings only added to the perception of a pope more concerned with temporal power than spiritual duty. He sought to mediate conflicts between European monarchs, not with impartiality, but with the careful aim of positioning the Orsini family advantageously. Even his relationship with the Byzantine Empire, which he approached with a mix of threat and diplomacy, was driven by a desire to extend Roman influence more than theological unity. His legacy of hypocrisy was immortalized in literature. In Dante Alighieri's Inferno, Nicholas III is damned to the eighth circle of hell, buried headfirst in a hole with flames licking at his feet, a punishment reserved for simoniacs, those who sold sacred office for personal gain. When Dante encounters his writhing figure, Nicholas mistakes him for the next corrupt pope to arrive. It was a vision of damnation that echoed what many of his contemporaries feared, that the shepherd of souls had become little more than a prince of Rome, hiding avarice behind the language of holiness. In the mid-15th century, amid the waning shadows of the medieval world and the first flickers of the Renaissance, Pope Eugene IV ascended to the papal throne with promises of reform. Born Gabriele Condulmer in Venice, he was a former Augustinian monk known for asceticism and theological conservatism. His election in 1431 was intended as a corrective to the extravagances of his predecessor, Martin V. But what followed was a papacy marked by mismanagement, brutal suppression, and failed councils. One that deepened the rift between East and West and sowed fresh seeds of discord within the Catholic fold. From the start, Eugene's papacy was defined by conflict with the Council of Basel. The council had been convened to address a number of pressing issues: church reform, heresy, and the reunification with the Eastern Orthodox Church. But Eugene, who viewed conciliar authority as a threat to papal supremacy, attempted to dissolve it almost immediately. His resistance sparked a crisis, with members of the council refusing to disband and openly challenging his authority. For a time, the church teetered on the edge of a second schism. Eugene eventually conceded ground and negotiated reunification with some Eastern patriarchs, culminating in the Council of Florence in 1439. Yet his handling of the negotiations was widely criticized for being coercive and dismissive of Eastern theological concerns. The union he brokered was short-lived and viewed by many as a hollow political maneuver. Meanwhile, closer to home, Eugene's governance of the Papal States was no less fraught. He engaged in military campaigns to maintain papal territory, including a devastating war against the Colonna family and other Roman nobles. His harsh fiscal policies and suppression of opposition provoked several rebellions in Rome. At one point, Eugene was driven from the city and forced to live in exile for nearly a decade, ruling the church from Florence as an absentee pope. Though he may have envisioned himself as a reformer and guardian of orthodoxy, his actual rule was erratic and divisive. He left behind a church more fractured than he had inherited, with growing distrust among both laity and clergy. By the time he died in 1447, Eugene IV had failed to repair the unity he so vocally championed, and his name was remembered less for holy leadership than for the dangerous rigidity that nearly split the church anew. In the early 11th century, the papacy was a prize passed between Roman aristocrats like a family heirloom, and Pope Benedict IX stands as its most infamous example, a man who held the papal office not once but 3 times, and whose personal conduct scandalized even the most cynical observers of his time. Born Theophylactus of the powerful Tusculani family, he was thrust into the papacy around 1032, likely no older than 20 and possibly even younger. His family secured the office for him through sheer political force and bribery. Almost immediately, Benedict IX's behavior became a matter of widespread concern. Chroniclers described his pontificate as a parade of immorality. Accusations swirled that he committed rape, murder, and acts of extreme debauchery within the walls of the Lateran palace. His papacy was so disgraceful that a revolt forced him to flee Rome in 1044. In his absence, a new pope was elected, Sylvester III, but Benedict returned within months with the support of his family's troops and reclaimed the throne. What followed next was perhaps the most shameless episode in papal history. Tired of the responsibilities and increasingly isolated, Benedict sold the papacy in 1045 to his godfather, the archpriest Giovanni Gratiano, for a large sum of gold. Gratiano assumed the papal name Gregory VI. It was the only known instance of a pope literally selling the office of St. Peter. But Benedict wasn't finished. Within a year, he claimed the papacy again, throwing Rome into chaos as 3 men, Benedict IX, Sylvester III, and Gregory VI, all claimed to be the legitimate pope. This scandal finally prompted Emperor Henry III to intervene. At the Council of Sutri in 1046, all 3 claimants were deposed, and a new pope, Clement II, was appointed by imperial authority. Benedict would attempt to return once more after Clement's death, but he never regained lasting control. His final years remain obscure, though some accounts suggest he died in a monastery. The Church, in the centuries that followed, would struggle to explain how the papal office had been reduced to a commodity traded like property. Benedict IX's legacy is not of leadership or theology, but of the absolute moral collapse of the papacy during one of its darkest hours. The brief but disastrous reign of Pope Stephen VI is remembered for one of the most grotesque spectacles in papal history, a macabre trial that became a symbol of just how far the Church could descend into political vengeance and absurdity. Stephen was elected pope in 896, during a period when the papacy was entangled in the violent struggles of Roman noble families. At the center of this chaos was the corpse of his predecessor, Pope Formosus. Formosus had died the year before, but his papacy had been divisive. He had feuded with powerful factions, including the Spoleto family and Stephen VI, who was allied with their interests, sought to discredit him entirely, even in death. What followed was the Cadaver Synod, a grim and surreal affair that shocked even the cynical political world of the time. Under Stephen's orders, Formosus's body was exhumed from its tomb, dressed in papal vestments, and propped up on a throne in the Lateran Basilica. A deacon was assigned to speak on the dead pope's behalf, while Stephen, trembling with fury, hurled accusations of perjury, ambition, and uncanonical ascension. The grotesque trial concluded with the corpse being found guilty. Stephen declared all of Formosus's acts and appointments null and void. The body was stripped of its sacred garments. The fingers used for blessings were cut off, and the corpse was thrown into the Tiber River. This act of ritual humiliation was met not with applause, but with horror. Riots erupted in Rome. The public, already weary of papal instability, turned against Stephen. Within months, he was deposed, imprisoned, and strangled to death in his cell. The Cadaver Synod was so reviled that subsequent popes annulled its decrees and ordered the recovery and reburial of Formosus's body. But the damage was already done. The event became a symbol of the papacy's descent into grotesque absurdity, a time when theological disputes and political vendettas were resolved not with councils or scripture, but with mutilated corpses and courtroom theater. Stephen VI did not invent corruption in the Church, but he embodied its ugliest excess, one where dignity, mercy, and sanity were abandoned entirely at the altar of revenge. In the first half of the 13th century, Pope Innocent IV ascended to the papacy during a period of escalating tension between spiritual authority and secular power. Born Sinibaldo Fieschi in Genoa, he was a skilled canon lawyer and shrewd diplomat. His election in 1243 was welcomed by many who hoped he might bring balance to the Church's fraught relationship with the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. Instead, Innocent IV turned the papacy into a weapon of total opposition, setting the stage for one of the most bitter feuds between Pope and Emperor in medieval Europe. From the start, Innocent sought to undermine Frederick, who had long claimed authority over both church and state and had challenged papal supremacy by asserting imperial rights in Italy. In 1245, just 2 years into his reign, Innocent convened the Council of Lyon, not to address reform or heresy, but to excommunicate and depose the emperor. It was a bold and unprecedented move. He declared Frederick a heretic and an enemy of the faith, absolving his subjects of loyalty and encouraging rebellion. The result was a civil war that engulfed large parts of Italy and Germany, destabilizing the region for years. Innocent's crusade against Frederick consumed his papacy. He forged alliances with the emperor's enemies, sent papal troops into battle, and taxed the clergy heavily to fund his campaigns. The Church, under Innocent's leadership, became as much a political actor as a spiritual one. While he claimed to act in defense of the faith, critics saw a pope bent on total control, using excommunication not as a spiritual corrective, but as a tool of conquest. Meanwhile, he oversaw the extension of the Inquisition across Europe, particularly in France, where it grew increasingly brutal under papal approval. Torture was authorized, property was seized, and thousands of accused heretics were imprisoned or executed, all under the banner of orthodoxy. Innocent of IV died in 1254, having failed to defeat Frederick, who outlived him by a year. Though hailed by some as a defender of the papal cause, his legacy is one of war, division, and the deepening entanglement of the Church in imperial politics. His reign did not purify the Church, it militarized it. During the Renaissance, the papacy became not only a spiritual authority, but a patron of art, a player in European diplomacy, and, too often, a stage for personal vanity. Few pontiffs embodied this transformation more vividly than Pope Leo X. Born Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici in 1475, Leo came from one of Italy's most powerful banking families. He was groomed for church leadership from a young age and elevated to cardinal at just 13. When he was elected pope in 1513, the Medici vision of grandeur came with him. The Vatican became a court of spectacle and splendor. But beneath the gold and pageantry lay decisions that would ignite the most profound spiritual crisis in the Church's history. Leo X's reign was one of lavish spending and fiscal recklessness. He poured vast sums into architecture, festivals, and art commissions, most notably supporting Raphael and Michelangelo. To fund these indulgences, the Church expanded the sale of indulgences, those spiritual pardons granted in exchange for monetary donations. While indulgences had long been part of Catholic practice, under Leo they were aggressively marketed, commodified, and exploited. One Dominican friar, Johann Tetzel, sold them with slogans that promised instant salvation for buyers or their loved ones in purgatory. This brazen commercialization of forgiveness outraged many, especially a German monk named Martin Luther. In 1517, Luther posted his 95 Theses, directly challenging the legitimacy of indulgences and papal authority. Leo X dismissed him at first as a drunken German who would change his mind. But when Luther refused to recant, Leo issued the papal bull Exsurge Domine in 1520, threatening excommunication. Luther responded by burning the bull in public. The Protestant Reformation had begun. Leo X, more a secular prince than a shepherd of souls, underestimated the crisis he had unleashed. He excommunicated Luther, but failed to grasp the scale of the movement or the deep grievances it reflected. His papacy, meant to be a celebration of Medici power and Renaissance beauty, became the symbol of excess that fractured Western Christianity. He died in 1521, reportedly from pneumonia, though some suspected poisoning. He left behind a church teetering on the brink of revolt and a legacy not of salvation, but of splendor paid for in souls. When Rodrigo Borgia ascended to the papal throne in 1492 as Pope Alexander VI, the world knew his name not for holiness, but for influence, cunning, and ambition. Born in Spain in 1431, Borgia had long been immersed in the politics of the Curia, serving as vice-chancellor of the church and acquiring a reputation for both administrative talent and personal indulgence. His election was widely believed to be the result of bribes and political promises, a pattern that would define his papacy. Alexander VI's reign is remembered not for spiritual reform or theological insight, but for the overt use of the papacy to advance the interests of the Borgia family. Almost immediately, he began elevating his children, yes, his acknowledged illegitimate children, to positions of enormous power. His son Cesare Borgia became both cardinal and military commander, a man whose ruthlessness inspired Machiavelli's The Prince. His daughter, Lucrezia, was married off strategically to form alliances with noble houses across Italy. Rome became a theater of Borgia dominance, where enemies disappeared and favors were bought at high cost. Alexander VI treated the papacy as a family enterprise. Simony, nepotism, and intrigue were not just tolerated, they were systematized. His court was notorious for its decadence. Boniface VIII left behind a papacy deeply compromised. His efforts to assert papal supremacy had instead accelerated the rise of secular monarchies. His successors would find themselves increasingly beholden to kings, culminating in the Avignon papacy and the Western Schism. In his zeal to elevate the Church's authority, Boniface unwittingly laid the groundwork for its political decline. He envisioned himself as the final word in Christendom, but history remembers him as the Pope who reached too far, too fast, and lost everything in the grasp. Pope Julius II, who reigned from 1503 to 1513, was known less for his spiritual leadership and more for his armor, ambition, and appetite for war. Born Giuliano della Rovere, he was the nephew of Pope Sixtus IV and rose through the ranks of the Church through family influence, political cunning, and raw determination. As Pope, Julius cast himself not as a shepherd of souls, but as a warrior pontiff, literally. He led armies into battle, donned military gear, and treated the papacy as a sovereign power to be expanded and defended like any temporal kingdom. His reign was one of bloodshed, alliances, and artistic glory, because even while commanding soldiers, he commissioned masterpieces. Julius's obsession was the unification and strengthening of the papal states. To achieve this, he waged relentless campaigns across Italy, battling against powerful families, mercenary armies, and foreign monarchs. He drove out the Borgias, resisted Venetian expansion, and challenged French interference. His military exploits reached a symbolic peak when he personally led troops to reclaim Bologna, defying age and tradition by standing at the front lines. While this martial vigor earned him admiration from some quarters, it also raised deep questions about the nature of papal power. Critics, including Erasmus and other reform-minded thinkers, saw in Julius a pope who preferred cannonballs to confession, and whose spiritual authority was buried beneath banners and blood. Yet Julius was not without a lasting cultural legacy. He commissioned the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, laying the foundation for the colossal structure that would become the architectural heart of Roman Catholicism. He employed Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, an act that alone might have immortalized his reign. But even his patronage of the arts was tied to power. He used beauty to assert papal dominance, to make the Vatican the envy of Europe, and to intimidate rivals through grandeur. In the end, Julius II died without having completed his wars. But the map of Italy had been redrawn, and the church's palace had become a fortress. His papacy exemplifies the Renaissance paradox: splendor and savagery intertwined, piety wrapped in steel. Julius called himself the liberator of Italy, but to many, he was simply the pope who turned the church into a battlefield. Pope Benedict XIX holds a unique and ignominious place in the history of the papacy, not for one scandalous reign, but for three. Born Theophylactus of the powerful Tusculani family around 1012, he was thrust onto the papal throne at the astonishingly young age of approximately 20, perhaps even younger, around the year 1032. His election was not the result of merit or divine inspiration, but pure aristocratic nepotism. The Tusculani had controlled the papacy for decades and saw the office as their inheritance. From the beginning, Benedict IX showed little interest in spiritual guidance. Chroniclers accused him of leading a life of debauchery, cruelty, and indulgence. Some even described his papal court as one of open vice, where violence and sin walked unchecked through the halls of the Lateran. Benedict's behavior so outraged the Roman clergy and nobility that they expelled him in 1044, only for him to return by force the following year. His second reign was short-lived. Facing growing pressure and uninterested in continuing his duties, Benedict did something unprecedented. He sold the papacy. In 1045, he agreed to step down in exchange for a substantial sum of money, transferring the office to his godfather, who became Pope Gregory VI. The idea of selling the highest spiritual seat in Christendom shocked even the jaded elite of medieval Europe. Though simony, buying or selling ecclesiastical offices, was already rampant, the sale of the papacy itself was a scandal without parallel. Yet the chaos didn't end there. Benedict would return once more in 1047, reclaiming the papacy briefly before being driven out yet again. His triple pontificate, marked by corruption, abandonment, and force, was symptomatic of a papacy under siege by noble families, each seeking to use the Holy See as a pawn in their own political games. The crisis triggered by Benedict's actions led to one of the most important reforms in church history. His disgrace spurred the Cluniac and Gregorian reformers to push for stronger rules around papal election, clerical celibacy, and the independence of the church from feudal control. In many ways, Benedict IX was the nadir from which reform was born. He was not merely a bad pope. He was a symptom of an era where the sacred had been sold, and the divine had to claw its way back from disgrace. Pope Clement V, elected in 1305, began his reign not in Rome but in France. a fact that would set off nearly a century of papal exile and weaken the spiritual authority of the Church across Europe. Born Bertrand de Got, a Frenchman and childhood friend of King Philip IV, Clement was elevated to the papacy after a contentious conclave following the death of Boniface VIII and the brief reign of Benedict XI. From the start, his election was seen as a victory for the French crown, and Clement made few efforts to dispel that impression. He never set foot in Rome during his entire papacy. Instead, he moved the papal court to Avignon in 1309, establishing what would become known as the Avignon Papacy, an era in which 7 consecutive popes ruled from French territory, drawing accusations of political captivity and moral compromise. Clement V's most notorious act, however, was his complicity in the destruction of the Knights Templar. Under immense pressure from Philip IV, who coveted the order's wealth and feared their independence, Clement agreed to suppress the Templars. Despite inconsistent evidence and confessions extracted under torture, he allowed a sham investigation to proceed. In 1312, under the guise of papal authority, Clement formally dissolved the order at the Council of Vienne. Its leaders, including Grand Master Jacques de Molay, were handed over to secular courts and ultimately executed. While Clement's supporters claimed he had no choice, his failure to defend the Templars exposed the papacy's deep vulnerability to secular power. It also tarnished the Church's image as a defender of justice. Beyond the Templar affair, Clement V's papacy was marked by financial exploitation. The Avignon court expanded its bureaucracy, increased taxation on clergy, and sold indulgences and dispensations with unprecedented frequency. Corruption flourished under his watch. Critics described Avignon as a gilded cage, rich in ritual and poor in virtue. Clement died in 1314, his legacy bound to the perception that the papacy had become little more than an extension of the French monarchy. In relocating the Holy See and sacrificing the Templars, Clement V did more than change the geography of the Church. He altered its very soul. Pope Stephen VI presided over one of the most grotesque and macabre episodes in papal history, the Cadaver Synod. His reign, which lasted from 896 to 897, occurred during a time of extraordinary political chaos in Rome, when rival factions of nobles, bishops, and warlords turned the papacy into a revolving door of vengeance and instability. Stephen himself was placed on the throne with the backing of the Spoleto family, one of the most powerful dynasties in Italy at the time. But rather than stabilize the Church, Stephen used his office to exact a posthumous revenge so shocking that even his contemporaries recoiled. The object of his wrath was his predecessor, Pope Formosus, who had died 9 months earlier. Formosus had made powerful enemies during his papacy, particularly among the Spoletans, whom he had tried to sideline politically. Stephen, seeking to avenge his patrons and assert his legitimacy, ordered the exhumation of Formosus's corpse from its tomb. The decomposing body, clad in papal vestments, was propped up in a chair inside the Lateran Basilica. A synod of bishops was convened, not to debate doctrine, but to put the dead pope on trial. A deacon was assigned to speak on behalf of the corpse, while Stephen shouted accusations and presided over the mockery with unhinged fury. The charges were largely political. Formosus had violated canon law by holding multiple bishoprics and had allegedly plotted against Stephen's supporters. The outcome was never in doubt. Formosus was found guilty, stripped of his vestments, had 3 fingers of benediction cut off, and was buried in a pauper's grave, only to be dug up again and thrown into the Tiber River. The spectacle scandalized both the Roman people and the broader Christian world. It brought no peace, only further instability. Riots erupted in Rome, and within months, Stephen VI was arrested, imprisoned, and strangled to death. His actions were later condemned by a new pope, and Formosus was reburied with honor. But the damage was done. The Cadaver Synod became a symbol of everything the papacy was not supposed to be, a house of sanctity reduced to a stage for vengeance. In Stephen VI, the papal office reached a depth so surreal and grotesque that it seemed less part of divine history than of tragic theater. Pope Leo X, who reigned from 1513 to 1521, presided over the Catholic Church at the very moment it was beginning to crack under the weight of its own opulence, corruption, and complacency. Born Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici, he was the second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and was made a cardinal at the age of 13. His election as pope was not merely a religious event. It was the crowning of Medici ambition, a moment when Florence's most powerful family placed one of its own at the apex of Christendom. Leo was a man of refined taste, a generous patron of the arts, and a lover of theater, hunting, and humanist scholarship. But beneath the glitter of the Renaissance court he cultivated, the Church's spiritual foundation was rotting, and Leo either did not see it or chose to ignore it. The most infamous act of his pontificate was the widespread sale of indulgences to fund the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. Although indulgences had long been a feature of Catholic penitential practice, under Leo they became commercialized on a grand scale. Agents like Johann Tetzel traveled through Germany selling forgiveness like a product. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs, Tetzel allegedly proclaimed. The scandal of this practice, coupled with growing resentment toward papal extravagance, ignited a fire that would consume the Western Church. In 1517, Martin Luther published his 95 Theses, directly challenging indulgences and, by extension, papal authority. Leo responded not with dialogue or reform, but with condemnation. He dismissed Luther as a drunken monk who would soon regret his insolence. By 1520, Leo had excommunicated him, but the damage was irreversible. Leo X's papacy was emblematic of the contradictions of the Renaissance Church. He surrounded himself with artists like Raphael and musicians whose compositions echoed through marble halls. Yet he failed to recognize or take seriously the mounting cries for reform. In his final years, the Reformation gained traction, and the Church's moral authority unraveled. Leo died in 1521, likely of pneumonia, leaving behind a papacy both dazzling and doomed. His reign marked the final crescendo before the schism, a time when Rome glowed with artistic brilliance, even as its spiritual core darkened with pride and denial. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, remains one of the most infamous figures ever to occupy the throne of St. Peter. His reign from 1492 to 1503 embodied the height of Renaissance corruption, where papal authority was used not to guide souls, but to secure power, pleasure, and legacy for one of Italy's most ambitious dynasties. A native of Valencia, Alexander rose through church ranks thanks in no small part to the influence of his uncle, Pope Calixtus III. His election to the papacy was widely believed to have been secured through blatant simony, with gold exchanged for votes in a process so brazen that even hardened Roman officials were shocked. But it was only after his coronation that the true scale of Borgia ambition became clear. Alexander treated the papacy as a family enterprise. He openly acknowledged and elevated his children, most famously Cesare and Lucrezia, granting them titles, land, and power in a nepotistic campaign that blurred the line between church and dynasty. Cesare, once a cardinal, became a military commander whose brutal conquests helped expand the papal states. Lucrezia was married off strategically, and though many of the darker rumors surrounding her may have been exaggerated by political enemies, the fact remains that Alexander orchestrated her life like a chess game, marrying and discarding alliances as needed. His reign was also riddled with scandal. Contemporary accounts speak of lavish banquets, orgies in the Vatican, and a level of personal indulgence that made even tolerant observers uneasy. He prioritized territorial control over spiritual renewal, issuing bulls and forging alliances to carve out dominion across central Italy. Alexander's relationship with other powers was pragmatic and ruthless. He manipulated France and Spain, promised favors to both sides, and reneged as needed to protect Borgia interests. His political instincts were sharp, but they served only his legacy, not the Church's. When he died suddenly in 1503, possibly from poisoning, though the cause remains uncertain, he left behind a Rome cynical and exhausted. The College of Cardinals moved swiftly to erase the Borgia stain, removing many of his appointees and distancing the papacy from the family's shadow. Yet the damage endured. Alexander VI exemplified what the papacy could become when stripped of its spiritual mandate, a throne of gold built on intrigue, lust, and fear. Pope Liberius, who ruled from 352 to 366, occupies a peculiar place in papal history, not for grand acts of tyranny or moral scandal, but for a moment of theological compromise that has haunted his legacy ever since. His papacy unfolded during the Arian controversy, a bitter conflict over the nature of Christ that divided the Christian world. At stake was a fundamental question. Was Christ truly divine, of the same substance as the Father, or was he a created being, subordinate and distinct? The Council of Nicaea in 325 had declared the full divinity of Christ, but many Eastern bishops and powerful emperors still favored a semi-Arian position. When Liberius became pope, he inherited not only a fractured church, but also the expectations of a Roman Empire determined to mold theology to its advantage. Emperor Constantius II, a sympathizer with the Arian position, demanded that Liberius condemn Athanasius of Alexandria, the foremost defender of Nicene orthodoxy. When Liberius refused, he was arrested and exiled to Thrace in 355. What followed is one of the most controversial episodes in early church history. After 2 years in exile, Liberius signed documents that appeared to be Arian or semi-Arian in nature, possibly under duress, and was allowed to return to Rome. This apparent capitulation caused outrage among staunch Nicene defenders. Though some argue that the documents were ambiguous or that Liberius never fully endorsed heresy, the perception of betrayal lingered. The scandal was amplified by the presence of an anti-pope, Felix II, whom Constantius installed in Liberius's absence, further muddying the waters of legitimacy. Liberius eventually reasserted his commitment to Nicene doctrine, and by the end of his life, he had restored his standing with many in the Church. Nevertheless, the shadow of his momentary submission remained. Later, popes worked to protect the reputation of the papal office by quietly omitting Liberius from some early lists of popes and saints. He is one of the few early pontiffs not canonized, a subtle acknowledgment of the tension his reign represents. Liberius's story is not one of villainy, but of the deep pressure placed on religious leaders when empire and doctrine collide. His brief surrender reminds us that even the office of Pope is not immune to fear, isolation, and the grinding machinery of imperial power. Pope Paul IV, who reigned from 1555 to 1559, brought with him a fierce, unbending sense of doctrinal purity and a zeal for authoritarian control that left an indelible mark on the Counter-Reformation Church. Born Gian Pietro Carafa, he was a career inquisitor and co-founder of the Theatines, a reformist order dedicated to moral rigor. But Paul IV's idea of reform was one driven not by compassion or dialogue, but by surveillance, suppression, and punishment. His elevation to the papacy came at a time when Protestantism had already fractured the unity of Western Christendom, and rather than build bridges or address internal corruption, Paul chose to double down on institutional severity. His reign is remembered not for healing wounds, but for deepening fear, especially within Rome itself. One of his first and most infamous acts was to intensify the powers of the Roman Inquisition. Under Paul IV, the Inquisition expanded dramatically, targeting not only heretics but also clergy, scholars, and artists suspected of unorthodox thinking. Torture was routine. Trials were secret. Fear became a daily reality for those living under his gaze. Paul also oversaw the creation of the first Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books, which banned works by authors ranging from Erasmus to Machiavelli. Scholarship became dangerous, and intellectual life in Catholic Europe withered under the weight of censorship. But Paul's authoritarianism didn't stop at theology. His virulent anti-Semitism led to the establishment of the Roman Ghetto in 1555, the first compulsory segregated quarter for Jews in the city's history. He forced Jews to wear yellow badges, banned them from owning property, and limited their professions. These policies formalized centuries of discrimination into institutional policy that would last for generations. Even within the College of Cardinals, Paul IV was feared. He reduced their autonomy, filled their ranks with like-minded hardliners, and kept a close watch on dissent. When he died in 1559, the Roman populace, exhausted by his oppressive rule, rioted. Mobs tore down statues of him, smashed his coat of arms, and nearly destroyed the Inquisition's headquarters. His death felt like the lifting of a cloud, yet his impact endured. Paul IV left behind a church more uniform, more centralized, and far more brutal in its self-defense. He did not stop Protestantism, but he ensured that Catholicism, under his vision, would become a fortress, with the walls reinforced by fear. Pope Innocent VIII, who reigned from 1484 to 1492, exemplified the moral decline of the late medieval papacy, a period in which spiritual leadership took a back seat to personal enrichment, nepotism, and worldly indulgence. Born Giovanni Battista Cibo, Innocent came to power at a time when the Renaissance papacy was thriving not in holiness, but in opulence. His reign saw no significant theological development or ecclesiastical reform. Instead, it was characterized by rampant favoritism, brazen simony, and a court life so decadent that many believed the Vatican had lost all sense of sacred mission. Innocent openly acknowledged his illegitimate children and married off one of his sons with the grandeur befitting a secular prince, complete with lavish feasts and gold-draped ceremonies. Stunning displays for a church meant to uphold vows of poverty and spiritual purity. One of Innocent VIII's most damaging legacies was his role in the formalization of witch hunts. In 1484, he issued the papal bull Summis Desiderantes Affectibus, which gave full backing to inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger to root out witchcraft across Germany. This document laid the groundwork for the infamous witch-hunting manual Malleus Maleficarum, published 2 years later. Though the bull did not invent the witch craze, it lent it ecclesiastical legitimacy and set off decades of hysteria, persecution and brutal executions. Thousands of women, especially the poor, elderly, and socially vulnerable, would suffer as a result. That a pope would amplify fear and superstition for political and theological control reflected the darker impulses of a church more interested in maintaining power than offering compassion. Innocent VIII also involved himself in international politics with little regard for peace. He blessed the slave trade by granting Portuguese rulers the right to capture non-Christians in Africa and sell them as property, a decision with devastating consequences for generations to come. Financially, his papacy was a disaster. The Vatican coffers ran dry under his watch, forcing him to sell offices and indulgences at record levels. Some contemporary accounts claimed that even cardinalships were available for purchase. When he died in 1492, Rome breathed a sigh of relief. His embalmed body, legend says, refused to remain whole, rotting from within. A fitting metaphor for a reign that had corrupted the very center of Christendom. Pope Sergius III, who reigned from 904 to 911, marks one of the darkest chapters in the papacy's long history, a period so rife with corruption, violence, and sexual intrigue that later historians dubbed it the Saeculum Obscurum, or the Dark Age of the Papacy. Sergius came to power not through sacred election, but through murder and brute force. After a tumultuous series of short-lived pontificates, Rome had descended into anarchy, and control of the papacy passed to the hands of powerful noble families. Sergius was installed with the backing of Theophylact of Tusculum, a Roman nobleman who, alongside his wife Theodora and daughter Marozia, would come to dominate papal politics for decades in what was effectively a dynastic regime hiding behind the facade of religious leadership. Once enthroned, Sergius had the corpse of his rival, Pope Formosus, exhumed yet again and annulled all of Formosus's ordinations, continuing the grim tradition of cadaver politics that had begun with Stephen VI's Cadaver Synod. But Sergius's scandal was not limited to political vengeance. He is widely believed to have fathered an illegitimate son with Marozia while she was still a teenager, an act that, even in the morally flexible standards of the 10th century Roman court, raised eyebrows. That son would later ascend to the papacy himself as Pope John XI, installed by his mother, further entrenching the intertwining of family ambition and sacred office. Under Sergius, the papacy became little more than a puppet throne for the Tusculani and Crescenti families, used to legitimize their secular rule and reward their allies. Sergius filled church offices with loyalists, ignored clerical discipline, and turned the papal palace into a court of excess. There was no pretense of spiritual leadership, only the raw exercise of temporal power. His rule set the tone for the next half-century, in which popes were often selected by aristocratic women, murdered by rivals, or removed by force. The sacral authority of the Bishop of Rome was at its weakest, not because of heresy or external persecution, but because of the internal collapse of conscience. Sergius III wasn't just a bad pope. He was a symptom of a church that, for a time, had forgotten what it was meant to be. Pope Urban VI, who reigned from 1378 to 1389, began his pontificate with high hopes for reform, but quickly descended into paranoia, cruelty, and violence, igniting one of the greatest crises in church history, the Western Schism. Born Bartolomeo Prignano, he was the Archbishop of Bari and not a cardinal, a rare occurrence in papal elections. Initially respected for his piety and administrative skill, Urban's election came at a time of deep unrest. The previous pope, Gregory XI, had died shortly after returning the papacy to Rome from Avignon. The Roman people, desperate to avoid the return of a French-dominated papacy, rioted and demanded the election of an Italian. Under immense pressure, the cardinals chose Urban, hoping he would be a compromise candidate. What they got instead was a man whose instability would tear the church in two. At first, Urban VI seemed determined to reform the curia and discipline the decadent habits of the cardinals, but his methods were erratic and often brutal. He berated his officials in public, accused cardinals of treason without cause, and grew increasingly tyrannical as his papacy progressed. Many of the cardinals who had elected him came to regret their decision and fled Rome. In Anagni, they declared his election invalid, citing the mob pressure during the conclave, and elected a rival pope, Clement VII, who returned to Avignon. Thus began the Western Schism, a 40-year period during which two, and later even three men simultaneously claimed to be the true pope, each backed by different European powers. This split not only fractured church authority, but also sowed confusion and despair among the faithful. For many, it was impossible to know which pope held the keys to heaven, or if either did at all. Urban responded to the schism not with diplomacy, but with further cruelty. He imprisoned and allegedly tortured dissenting cardinals. In one infamous episode, he had 5 cardinals arrested, subjected them to starvation and beatings, and eventually executed them without trial. His behavior became so erratic that even his allies began to distance themselves. When he died in 1389, he left behind a church in chaos and a legacy of authoritarianism that had shattered rather than reformed. Urban VI may have aimed to purify the church, but his methods were so corrosive that they nearly destroyed its unity altogether. Pope John XII, who reigned from 955 to 964, is often cited as the most morally degenerate pope in the history of the Church, an accusation that, remarkably, is not an exaggeration born of later Protestant polemic, but one supported by contemporary chroniclers and even his own political allies. Born Octavianus, he was appointed pope at just 18 years old, thanks to the influence of his powerful father, Alberic II of Spoleto, who effectively ruled Rome as a secular prince. Upon his father's death, Octavianus merged his noble inheritance with papal authority, taking the name John XII. It was a disastrous union of unchecked youth, privilege, and sacred power. From the outset, John treated the papacy not as a holy office, but as a means to indulge his every appetite, sexual, financial, and violent. Accounts from the period, particularly those from Bishop Liutprand of Cremona, describe a Vatican-turned brothel, where John was said to host orgies in the Lateran palace, sleep with noblewomen and his own relatives, and even toast to pagan gods at feasts. He was accused of simony, mutilating opponents, and blinding critics. Though some of these accusations may have been exaggerated by enemies, the sheer volume and consistency of these reports point to a pattern of extreme abuse. His reign alarmed even secular rulers. In a desperate attempt to maintain control, John allied himself with the German king Otto I, crowning him Holy Roman Emperor in 962 in exchange for protection. But when Otto began to reform Rome and demand accountability, John turned on him, plotting conspiracies with local nobles and sending secret letters to foreign powers. Otto responded by marching into Rome and convening a synod that deposed John in absentia, accusing him of perjury, incest, murder, and sacrilege. A new pope, Leo VIII, was installed, but John regained power after Otto left the city. His second tenure was short-lived. In 964, John XII died under sordid circumstances, allegedly in bed with a married woman, either of stroke or, as one account suggests, bludgeoned to death by her husband. His demise was as chaotic and dishonorable as his life. John XII's papacy was not merely scandalous, it was a grotesque parody of the office. In him, the sacred was dragged so low that even Rome's corrupt nobility found it intolerable. Pope Boniface VIII, who ruled from 1294 to 1303, represents one of the most dramatic confrontations between spiritual authority and secular power in medieval history. His papacy, marked by soaring ambition and fierce political entanglement, culminated in humiliation that shocked Christendom and revealed the waning influence of the papacy over European monarchs. Born Benedetto Caetani, Boniface was a skilled canon lawyer and political operator who succeeded the humble and reluctant Pope Celestine V. One of Boniface's first acts was to force Celestine's resignation, an act legal but ethically murky, and imprison him to prevent any possibility of schism. From the beginning, Boniface ruled with a heavy hand, asserting the absolute supremacy of the Pope over all earthly rulers, a doctrine made explicit in his 1302 bull Unam Sanctam. In that document, Boniface declared that salvation was not possible outside submission to the Roman pontiff. It was a sweeping, theologically daring claim and a provocation to secular rulers, particularly King Philip IV of France. Boniface's attempts to assert papal taxation rights over French clergy clashed directly with Philip's efforts to consolidate royal authority. The resulting feud escalated from diplomatic sparring to open hostility. Philip accused Boniface of heresy, simony, and even murder, charges unfounded but politically effective. In 1303, matters came to a head when Philip's agent, Guillaume de Nogaret, and members of the Colonna family stormed the papal residence in Anagni, capturing Boniface in a shocking show of force. According to chroniclers, the Pope was struck in the face, imprisoned, and held for 3 days before being freed by local townspeople. Though he returned to Rome, Boniface never recovered from the ordeal. He died a month later, broken and possibly mad. His downfall sent a chilling message across Europe. The papacy, long the supreme moral voice of Christendom, could now be publicly humiliated and defied. The Anagni outrage, as it came to be called, shattered the aura of untouchability that had surrounded the Pope for centuries. Boniface VIII had overreached, challenging kings with the authority of saints, and lost. His ambition to restore papal dominance ended not in glory, but in disgrace, setting the stage for the Avignon papacy and a long period of diminished papal prestige. Pope Julius II, who reigned from 1503 to 1513, is remembered less for spiritual guidance than for his armor. Known as the warrior pope, Julius was a man of iron will and explosive temper, whose primary concern was not the salvation of souls, but the expansion of papal territory and power. Born Giuliano della Rovere, he was a nephew of Pope Sixtus IV and rose through church ranks thanks to family influence and political savvy. Once elected pope, Julius wasted no time in setting aside the meekness expected of a spiritual shepherd. He donned military garb, led armies into battle, and waged war to restore the papal states, seeing himself not as a mere bishop, but as a prince and commander of Christendom. Julius launched campaigns against Bologna, Perugia, and even Venice, bringing cities to heel through bloodshed and siege. His most audacious move was the formation of the Holy League in 1511, an alliance of European powers, including Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, designed to expel French influence from Italy. These were not wars of defense or principle. They were expressions of raw geopolitical ambition. Julius believed that a strong papacy required temporal might, and he pursued that vision relentlessly, even at the cost of widespread destruction and suffering among civilians. His military ventures drained the church's coffers and fueled the resentment of those who believed that the papacy had abandoned its divine mission for the vanity of conquest. Ironically, Julius's reign was also a high point of Renaissance patronage. He commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and began the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, ushering in an age of unprecedented artistic brilliance. But these accomplishments came at a heavy cost. The sale of indulgences to fund these massive projects would soon provoke outrage and catalyze the Protestant Reformation. For all his patronage of the arts, Julius ruled as a secular prince, barking orders, raising taxes, and excommunicating enemies with a brutality that scandalized many of his contemporaries. When he died in 1513, he left behind a church more splendid in marble and paint, but deeply fractured in spirit. Julius II's legacy is that of a pope who chose sword over sermon and reshaped the papacy into a throne of iron and ambition. Pope Clement VII, who held the papacy from 1523 to 1534, presided over one of the most disastrous periods in papal history, a time marked by military defeat, political miscalculation, and the shattering of Catholic unity in England. Born Giulio de' Medici, the illegitimate son of Giuliano de' Medici and a cousin of Pope Leo X, Clement inherited the Renaissance papacy's taste for grandeur, but lacked its decisiveness. Though well-educated and intelligent, he was cautious to the point of paralysis. That hesitancy proved catastrophic as the Reformation swept through Europe and the political rivalry between France and the Holy Roman Empire intensified. Clement found himself at the center of a geopolitical storm and proved unequal to the task of navigating it. His most infamous failure came in 1527, when he miscalculated in choosing to ally with France against Emperor Charles V. When imperial troops, many of them unpaid and mutinous, descended upon Rome, Clement was unprepared. The resulting sack of Rome was one of the most horrific events of the 16th century. For 8 days, soldiers looted churches, raped nuns, burned homes, and butchered civilians. Thousands died, and countless treasures of Christian art and history were destroyed. Clement himself was forced to take refuge in Castel Sant'Angelo, where he remained under siege, helpless and humiliated. The spectacle of a pope under imperial guard, surrounded by the ruins of Christendom's holiest city, sent shockwaves through Europe. It symbolized not only the failure of Clement's diplomacy, but the vulnerability of the entire church. Even beyond the walls of Rome, Clement's indecisiveness carried historic consequences. When King Henry VIII of England requested an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon in order to wed Anne Boleyn, Clement stalled. He feared offending Charles V, Catherine's nephew, but also feared the consequences of denying the king. The result was a protracted delay that angered Henry and led him to break from Rome entirely, establishing the Church of England and igniting the English Reformation. Clement lost both moral authority and political control, ushering in a centuries-long schism. By the time he died in 1534, the Catholic Church had been battered, humbled, and territorially diminished. Clement VII's papacy stands as a cautionary tale, not of wickedness but of weakness, where inaction proved as ruinous as corruption. Pope Honorius I, who reigned from 625 to 638, occupies a rare and troubling place in papal history as the only pope formally condemned for heresy by an ecumenical council. His tenure came during a time of deep theological dispute over the nature of Christ, particularly the question of whether Christ possessed one will or two. This issue, known as the monothelite controversy, attempted to resolve divisions between Eastern and Western Christianity by proposing that while Christ had two natures, divine and human, he operated through a single divine will. It was a theological compromise intended to maintain imperial unity, especially under the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, who sought to avoid renewed religious conflicts across the empire. But in trying to please both sides, Honorius ended up undermining doctrinal clarity at the heart of Christian belief. Honorius, in a series of letters, supported a version of monothelitism and advised that the issue should not be discussed publicly, lest it provoke further division. Rather than affirm the orthodox teaching of two wills in Christ, he took the position that Christ had one will and discouraged theological debate, effectively enabling heresy through omission and silence. Though he did not invent the doctrine, his failure to uphold orthodoxy gave tacit approval to a teaching that would later be condemned. After his death, the controversy continued to simmer until it exploded at the Third Council of Constantinople in 680 to 681. The council condemned monothelitism as heresy, and along with it explicitly named Honorius as a pope who had allowed the Immaculate Faith to be stained and betrayed the apostolic tradition. The posthumous condemnation of a pope shook the Church's image of doctrinal infallibility. Defenders of papal authority scrambled to reinterpret Honorius's actions, arguing that he erred as a private theologian rather than as the official voice of the Church. But the damage was done. For centuries, his case remained a thorn in the side of apologists and a rallying point for critics of papal supremacy. Honorius was not a corrupt pope, nor a violent one. He did not indulge in nepotism or war. Yet his failure was profound. In a moment of deep theological need, he chose political quiet over truth and left a legacy that forced the Church to confront the fallibility of its highest office. Pope Benedict IX is one of the strangest and most scandalous figures to ever wear the tiara, not least because he held the papacy not once but 3 times between 1032 and 1048. His bizarre career reads more like a medieval farce than sacred history, full of bribery, violence, and moral depravity. Born Theophylactus of Tusculum into one of the most powerful aristocratic families in Rome, he was appointed pope in his early 20s. Some sources suggest he may have been as young as 11 or 12, though the more accepted range is late teens or early 20s. Either way, he was entirely unprepared and unqualified for the spiritual and moral responsibilities of the office. His first reign quickly descended into chaos. Accusations of rape, murder, and orgies in the Lateran palace circulated widely, with chroniclers describing him as a demon from hell in the disguise of a priest. His behavior so disgusted the Roman populace that he was driven out of the city in 1044. An anti-pope, Sylvester III, was elected in his place, but Benedict soon returned and expelled him. Then, in 1045, Benedict did something nearly unprecedented. he sold the papacy. Needing money and apparently bored with the burdens of office, he agreed to resign in exchange for a payment from his godfather, the archpriest Giovanni Gratiano, who became Pope Gregory VI. This act of simony was so blatant and shocking that it enraged reformers and further blackened the already tarnished image of the papacy. But Benedict wasn't finished. Later that same year, he decided he wanted the papacy back and returned with military support, setting off a period in which three rival claimants to the throne of Peter fought for supremacy. The chaos forced the Holy Roman Emperor Henry III to intervene. At the Council of Sutri in 1046, all three popes, Benedict IX, Gregory VI, and Sylvester III, were deposed. A new pope, Clement II, was installed, and Benedict was excommunicated. Yet even then, Benedict would briefly reclaim the papacy again in 1047 before being driven out for good. His final departure ended one of the most disgraceful chapters in church history. Benedict IX's papacies, plural, remain a grotesque testament to how deeply corruption and aristocratic entitlement could infect even the holiest office. He didn't just tarnish the papacy, he turned it into a commodity. Pope Stephen VI, who reigned from 896 to 897, is remembered almost exclusively for one of the most macabre and grotesque spectacles in church history, the Cadaver Synod. In a period of intense political instability following the death of Charlemagne, the papacy had become a pawn in the hands of rival Roman noble families. Stephen, installed with the backing of the powerful Spolitan faction, sought to erase the legacy of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, who had fallen out of favor with the Spolitans during his lifetime. But rather than simply denounce Formosus or reverse his policies, Stephen did something unprecedented. He put the corpse of Formosus on trial. In early 897, Stephen had Formosus's body exhumed from its tomb, dressed in papal vestments, and propped up in a chair in the Basilica of St. John Lateran. A deacon was appointed to speak on the dead pope's behalf while Stephen, consumed with rage, conducted a trial accusing Formosus of perjury, coveting the papacy, and violating canon law. The spectacle was shocking not only in its absurdity, but in its sacrilege. The grotesque image of a decaying pope being berated and judged by his successor in full public view stunned observers across Europe. The court declared Formosus guilty, annulled all his acts, and, after stripping him of his sacred garments, cut off the 3 fingers he had used to bless, then buried him in a common grave. When rumors spread that miracles were occurring at the site, the body was dug up once more and thrown into the Tiber River. The backlash was immediate. Roman citizens, already weary of the factional violence and moral rot within the church, rioted. Stephen was arrested and imprisoned, and within months he was strangled in his cell, likely by agents of rival factions seeking to restore some semblance of order. The Cadaver Synod left a stain so deep that even later popes would avoid speaking of it. The entire affair was eventually annulled, and Formosus was reburied with honor. But the damage was lasting. In Stephen VI's bizarre pursuit of revenge, The sacred dignity of the papacy was defiled, not by enemies of the Church, but from within its own walls. His reign stands as a surreal warning of what happens when power, paranoia, and ritual collide in the absence of mercy or sanity. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, ruled from 1492 to 1503, and is often considered the pinnacle of Renaissance papal corruption. His name has become synonymous with nepotism, decadence, and the entanglement of the sacred office with the ruthless machinery of secular ambition. The Borgia family, originally from Spain, had been amassing influence in Rome for decades, but it was Rodrigo who brought their power to its apex and infamy. His election to the papacy was tainted from the start, purchased with lavish bribes and promises of favors to the voting cardinals. Once in power, Alexander wasted no time transforming the papal court into a political dynasty that served the interests of his children, most notably Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia. Cesare, who initially held a cardinal's hat, later shed his clerical robes to become a military commander and political assassin. Backed by papal resources, he carved out a brutal dominion in central Italy, leaving a trail of blood and betrayal. Alexander VI not only condoned Cesare's ambitions, but orchestrated many of them, using church revenues to finance campaigns of conquest. Lucrezia, meanwhile, was married off repeatedly to forge strategic alliances. Rumors, many exaggerated but persistent, swirled around the nature of her relationships, including suggestions of incest, poisoning, and manipulation. The Vatican became a palace of intrigue where spiritual guidance was secondary to political maneuvering, and the sacraments themselves were rumored to be tools in the Borgia family's arsenal of control. Alexander VI's tenure also saw flagrant displays of personal vice. He hosted lavish banquets, allowed mistresses into the Vatican, and fathered multiple children during his time as pope. At a time when Protestant discontent was beginning to simmer, his papacy embodied every accusation of moral failure the reformers would later make. Even his death was surrounded by scandal. He fell ill shortly after a banquet, and though it is likely he died of malaria, tales of poisoning and retribution circulated widely. The Vatican had to bribe undertakers to handle his bloated, discolored corpse, which reportedly decomposed so rapidly that it burst the coffin seams. Alexander VI left behind a church both wealthier and more deeply compromised than he found it. His reign did not simply mark a moral decline, it gave it a face. Pope Leo X, who reigned from 1513 to 1521, inherited the Church at the height of the Renaissance and presided over the spark that would ignite the Protestant Reformation. Born Giovanni de' Medici, son of the powerful Lorenzo the Magnificent, Leo was steeped in the grandeur of Florence's cultural and political elite. He was made a cardinal at just 13 years old and was raised more as a prince than a priest. Once elected pope, Leo turned the Vatican into a showcase of humanist learning, artistic splendor, and lavish celebration. He continued the patronage of artists like Raphael and supported the construction of the new St. Peter's Basilica. But while the surface of his papacy glittered with gold, the foundation was crumbling beneath him. Leo's greatest misstep, both in consequence and in symbolism, was the sale of indulgences to fund the construction of St. Peter's. The practice itself was not new, but under Leo it reached a level of shameless exploitation that shocked even seasoned critics. Preachers like Johann Tetzel promised full remission of sins for those who contributed, turning spiritual grace into a financial transaction. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs became a common slogan. It was this abuse that drove the Augustinian monk Martin Luther to nail his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Church in 1517, challenging the Church's authority and launching what would become a seismic break in Western Christianity. Leo responded not with reform but with condemnation. He excommunicated Luther in 1521, dismissing the growing dissent as a monk's tantrum and underestimating the cultural and political forces at play. He failed to grasp that the world had changed, that the printing press, rising nationalism, and theological frustration had created a storm no papal bull could silence. By the time Leo died later that year, the Church had begun to fracture in ways that would never fully heal. His papacy is a study in contrasts, dazzling in its artistic achievement, disastrous in its spiritual stewardship. Leo X ruled like a Renaissance prince, not a shepherd of souls. And in doing so, he allowed the Church to drift, ornate, confident, and blind, into an age of upheaval it could not control. Pope Paul IV, who ruled from 1555 to 1559, exemplifies the dark turn the Counter-Reformation could take when driven by fear, suspicion, and uncompromising ideology. Born Gian Pietro Carafa, he had served as a cardinal inquisitor and was one of the founding forces behind the Roman Inquisition, a machinery of repression designed to root out heresy, silence dissent, and preserve Catholic orthodoxy in the face of Protestant reform. Once elected Pope, Paul IV brought his austere and fanatical vision to the highest office in Christendom. He believed the Church needed purification, but his methods reflected the severity of a man obsessed with control. To him, mercy was weakness, and deviation was treason. His reign was a storm of censorship, excommunication, and persecution. Paul IV expanded the index of forbidden books and applied it with a zeal previously unseen. Great humanist texts, including works by Erasmus and even some church fathers, were banned outright. Clergy were forbidden from reading or owning unapproved material, and religious inquiry was suffocated beneath the weight of dogma. He intensified the operations of the Inquisition in Italy, sending countless men and women to imprisonment, torture, or exile for even the mildest hints of unorthodoxy. The once vibrant intellectual culture of the Renaissance papacy dimmed under his rule, replaced by suspicion and silence. He also institutionalized anti-Jewish policy in ways that would resonate for centuries. In 1555, he issued the Bull Cum Nimis Absurdum, which forced Jews in Rome into a ghetto, imposed strict curfews, limited economic participation, and mandated humiliating dress codes. Paul's foreign policy was equally disastrous. He alienated Spain and France in his efforts to maintain papal independence, dragging Rome into conflicts that left it isolated and vulnerable. His hatred of the Spanish Habsburgs led him into reckless political gambits that backfired spectacularly. When Spanish troops marched on Rome in 1557, he was forced into humiliating peace terms. Despite his failures, Paul IV never wavered in his belief that he was God's instrument and that his severity was a reflection of divine justice. Upon his death in 1559, the people of Rome rioted, tore down his statues, and burned the buildings of the Inquisition. His portrait was defaced, and a grateful city exhaled. Paul IV's legacy is one of terror cloaked in righteousness, a reign that sought to purify by fire and left only ashes in its wake. Pope Sixtus IV, who reigned from 1471 to 1484, is perhaps best remembered today for commissioning the Sistine Chapel. But behind that magnificent ceiling lies a darker legacy, one of corruption, nepotism, and political violence that embodied the moral contradictions of the Renaissance Church. Born Francesco della Rovere, Sixtus was a Franciscan theologian before becoming pope, and his early promise as a reform-minded cleric quickly gave way to the brutal pragmatism of power. His papacy marked a sharp turn toward dynastic ambition as he elevated numerous family members to cardinalates and lucrative positions across Italy. His nepotism was so blatant that it reshaped the very language of church politics. The word itself, nepotism, became inseparably linked with his rule. Among the most notorious of his actions was his alleged complicity in the Papacy conspiracy of 1478, a failed attempt to assassinate Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother Giuliano in the Cathedral of Florence during Easter Mass. While Sixtus never admitted direct involvement, the conspiracy was backed by members of the Pope's own family, including his nephew Girolamo Riario, and carried out with the quiet support of the papal court. When the plot failed and Giuliano was killed while Lorenzo survived, Florence erupted in fury. Sixtus responded not with contrition, but by excommunicating the entire city and launching a brutal war against it. This misuse of spiritual authority for personal and political vendetta shocked many contemporaries and further eroded the papacy's moral standing. Sixtus IV also expanded the sale of indulgences, treating them as a financial instrument to fill the papal treasury. The money funded not only churches and libraries, but also military campaigns and family luxuries. Under his reign, the papacy became less a beacon of spiritual leadership and more a secular power broker in the Italian peninsula. Yet the contradiction of his papacy is stark. The man who funded hospitals and restored Rome's infrastructure was also the man who weaponized religion, sold grace, and nearly turned Florence into a battlefield. Sixtus IV left behind a Rome adorned in splendor. But behind the marble and frescoes, the soul of the Church bore the deep scars of ambition, intrigue, and betrayal.